always hold my card up, my cue card up at the very beginning because I'm hoping it will help me to differentiate which tape is which. And then I go and do the tapes, and it's some other picture from the same thing. So I don't know. I've tried hard to figure out, and maybe I should have changed shirts every single time. Anyway, so what I've told you so far, of course, and the major issue is the House divide. In the antebellum period, the North and the South began to diverge. It's really the North taking off in its own particular direction, of course, drawn away from the South by the forces of modernization, its urbanization, immigration, and industrialization, taking the North on in a very different trajectory, of course. And causing all kinds of difficulties in the North. It's changing so rapidly that people feel out of whack. They are turning, it creates a foundation for a reform movement to try to fix things because they feel like everything is so really messed up that they create a reform movement, and there's going to be revivals, there's going to be the utopian communities. They're trying to create the public schools to help to bring order. They're creating institutions, which will also help them create a more orderly society. And then ultimately, of course, a whole bunch of Northerners are falling into this kind of anti-slavery expression of abolitionism, which, if nothing else, is going to drive even more of a wedge between the North and the South. But here's the North just changing rapidly, just undergoing all kinds of stuff, and the South is just totally different at this time. I mean, there really is a very distinct difference, and it really is like they're two separate countries when you're entering it, especially into the 1850s. So for the North, my theme notion was in the thrall of change. I mean, they're like in the dryer of change, getting tossed around by it because so much is happening at that time. But in the South, it's very different, and so the construct I'm using here, this is a Southern construct, is the notion of place over time, place over time. I'm not sure that will mean anything to you when you hear it in the first instance, but let me just try to explain it to you, okay? So in the South, it didn't matter what time it was, it mattered where you were. And of course, where you were was in the South. In California, in so much of Southern California, especially that I know of, I mean, it doesn't matter where you are, it matters what time it is, because the location will change dramatically over time. So whenever I'm standing with you guys, I haven't been there for a while, but in the MD building, up there on the 3rd floor, I can remember the older Palomarts. It's pretty much the same spot, but I used to teach a class all the way down on the floor. The building down there at that time was a 1-story building, was the Chem building. I'm not sure it's exactly below, MD 306, but it's somewhere down there, okay? And I remember that it was a science lab, or science lecture hall, I should say, done in a little bit of a theater kind of situation, and there was a big, I don't know, like place where burners, like you could do experiments or something over here, and then it had a huge, that science desk, the counter with a sink on it, and a little thing for the gas to come out and something else to come out, I always feel it's like an awkward place for the students because they were just jammed together with little teeny little pop-up little desk things. And here we are, today, of course, and we're sitting in this modern building, of course, with big, beautiful windows, and I don't know, everything about that building I kind of really like, where my office is, etc. It doesn't matter when we are there. No, it only matters when we're there. It doesn't matter where we're there, same place. But everything changes, of course. California just kind of is building itself and developing. I can't tell you how many orange groves that I've seen go by. And I used to drive, my family would drive down the old 395, of course, on our way from Riverside down towards Ensenada. And, much of that has just been obliterated by the building up of Interstate 215 and Interstate 15. And then, of course, we go through the Temecula area, and there was nothing. They used to call it Rancho California, nothing really even there. And then south of Escondido, nothing there, all the way to Kearny Mesa, basically, And now it's a corridor of all kinds, of course, of developments that are taking place. So in a place like California, change is the thing. It doesn't matter where you are, it matters when you're there, because the place is going to change dramatically. Well, the Southerners didn't want that, right? They wanted the place to be the thing. And they didn't want time to matter. And what that really means is they want to keep things the same as much as they possibly could. They believed in the continuities, and they believed in a stable, unchanging society, and as much as they possibly could, that was what they were going to have. So the South is not about change. The South is about keeping it the same as much as they possibly could. Now, in the moment as we're heading into the Civil War, one of the things that's just interesting is a song will be written, and it's written by a Northerner, and that seems interesting to me, but it's written kind of about the South. And it starts out, with this line, "I wish I was in the land of cotton, 'cause old times there are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland." Dixie was written, in this moment. It became a Southern anthem, basically. But if you think about that first verse, it's an implied critique of the North. The North is changing. The North is losing all of its kind of, all of its past, all of its traditions. And he wishes he was in the land of cotton because the old times there are not forgotten. The North is forgetting everything that's old. It's only what's new. In the South, no, that's not the way we're going to do this. So, the South, as the North is changing drastically, of course, the Southerners are saying no. We're gonna keep this as much the way it is as we possibly can, and for lots of different reasons. They always knew that they had to keep grounded in this what they call their peculiar institution. And even they were willing to say that slavery was a peculiar institution, but it was theirs. It was the way it was, and they knew that if change came in, it could be damaging to their well-being. They knew that they could have made a lot more money off of cotton. I mean, the way you make money off of cotton is you turn it into textiles. That's the big money. That's the British money. That's what the British were doing. But they didn't want to do that. They just wanted to make their cotton, grow their cotton, gin their cotton, bale their cotton, ship their cotton, because they were holding on to the way of life that they had with slaves and with the plantation. If factories came in, stuff like that came in, it would transform them, and they didn't want it, okay? So we're looking at a society that is very much self-consciously trying to hold on to its past and trying to hold on to the identity that comes from the past. So it's much easier to tell you about the South. First of all, just understand just the significant difference here. So I'm going to just describe the South using basic characteristics. The North is changing like it's going on south. The South is just keeping it very real, and so it's kind of easy to suggest exactly what the South is all about. So here we go. It's a basic kind of situation with essential and basic characteristics. One characteristic, and these are all presented in distinction to the North. So the North is becoming increasingly urban, of course. We see the cities beginning to develop in the North. The South remains overwhelmingly rural, with an excess of 90% of the population living in rural areas. I told you there's only 2 cities of note, Charleston and New Orleans. I told you that most of, the capitals, even like Montgomery, Alabama, Jackson, Mississippi, Atlanta, Georgia, they're really villages. They're not much of anything, essentially. So we have a society that is retaining that rural identity, which they had all the way from the colonial period. So overwhelmingly rural. The Southern society was first of all, the North becoming quite diversified in all kinds of activities. We see the Industrial Revolution beginning to manifest. The South remained overwhelmingly agrarian. That means that the vast majority of the people are engaged in agriculture. And of course, the vast majority of those engaged in agriculture are engaged in cotton agriculture. And remember, this crosses the race lines, the white people and the black people. It is an agrarian society. And agrarian societies, of course, again, are holding on to a greater level of antiquity. The agrarian societies go back to the agricultural revolution, governed by these sort of simple rhythms of the seasons. You plant in the spring, you harvest in the fall. So this gives us, in another sense, kind of just the base conservatism, but the continuities that the Southerners were all about. Okay, whereas the North was becoming increasingly heterogeneous. So that means it has a lot of people from a lot of places. I did tell you that the vast majority of the immigrants come to the North, and just has quite, and even Southerners would often, some of them would, especially from the northern tier, they're kind of migrate into the North also. The South remained very homogeneous. So homogeneous means, of like origin. If you look at the South, you find out that about 90% of the Southerners are born in the South, so all the Southerners are Southerners. And by the way, that crosses the race line, the black people and the white people. And there's nothing so much as a shared experience between like white and black in the South. They're living under that same southern sun. They're feeling that same humidity, of course, especially in the summertime. And they have that same experience, of course, of the agrarian lifestyle, that same experience of the extraordinary interactions with cotton. All of that stuff it creates this incredible homogeneity. In the North, they're doing all kinds of crazy stuff and a variety of different kinds of activities. In the South, you have a society that is just deeply Southern, essentially. It's just the way it is, and it shows us a distinction, and of course creates the foundations of a very basic society. The South also, the North is going crazy, I told you. The North is undergoing tremendous amount of change, kind of freaking out, feeling dislocated, feeling chaotic, and having to confront that. The South remains overwhelmingly stable, self-conscious stability. Change is in some ways a decision. Change is in some ways a naturally occurring phenomenon. I cannot help myself from getting older. It's just one of the things you just can't do, right? But, you can, lots of other kind of changes are a decision. It's a choice. Do you want to go with the most modern technology? And of course, up until this moment, I've tried to avoid it assiduously. I never wanted to have to know about Canvas, and yet here I am engaged deeply in Canvas and know quite a bit about Canvas, to be honest with you. And I may be pretty soon trying to do a Zoom connection with my students, all these things. And I've actually participated in 2 Zooms. I got to tell you, kind of fun. Did it with my department, did it with my family. It is kind of a cool thing. We had our little Zoom cocktail hour, Zoom happy hour with some of my friends. but that's a choice, and the Southerners are making they're making a choice not to move forward. They didn't want to have factories. They didn't want modernization. They didn't want cities. That wasn't the world that they wanted. So it was their decision to stay the same as much as they possibly could. So you have this kind of inherent stability that becomes just an expression of what the South is all about. I mean, instability would be the way you describe the North. The South, very stable, on their own terms. Now, this last one I always find intriguing. I am a student of the American South. And the reason I am a student of the American South, the antebellum South, was because when I was a graduate student, I became obsessed basically with slavery. And I was obsessed with racism just throughout the dynamics of my life. As a child of the 1960s, of course, seeing the civil rights activities and seeing what was going on with the African American community. I have to tell you, I mean, to me, the black people were heroes of that period. I look at them and I saw their struggle, and I saw that they had so many things to overcome. And here I'm a little white bread little boy, thinking that there's no problem for me. I just had to go about my life and not really realizing the dynamics of privilege, of course, but living them, nonetheless, basically. And when I saw Martin Luther King or any of the civil rights leaders, I saw them as these heroic individuals, and I saw this community coming together. Of course, African Americans. It's like if you were in a room or DMV, and there were 20 white people in a line and 2 black people. The 2 black people would talk to each other, communicate, and the white people standing there like there's no association with them whatsoever. And and seeing the bonds of the African American society, all this stuff was just sort of amazing to me. And I wanted to understand the issues of race in America. And so when I got to graduate school, I was all about slavery. I got so lucky. My PhD comp question, and for my PhD for the doctorate was on slavery, the historiography of slavery. And I was so engrossed in all of that stuff. My professor, one of the commentaries said this was the best essay they had ever read on the historiography of slavery. And it was just, it wasn't because I was brilliant, it was just because I was kind of in love. I just wanted to know everything and be able to express everything. But, as I focused on what I wanted to do as a historian, I focused on the antebellum South. And the reason I did so was I saw the South as at least the homeland of an essential pathology of America. When it's like the great pathology of America, and that pathology is slavery moving towards ultimately evolving to racism. So like if I was a doctor, I would want to try to study cancer or Alzheimer's or something, one of these big deals is sort of critical right now. It'd be wonderful if you're a doctor to be figuring out, how do we deal with COVID-19 or something like that, and coming up with a vaccine or solution. But in American history, the same thing that me trying to find out the essential cancer of American history, would be to look at slavery. Slavery is an essential cancer in our society, right? And it's something that almost all of us want to eradicate. We see it as this horrible thing that we've had to deal with. So when I was focusing on the South, I did so because I saw it as pathological. Pathological means bad. That's a bad thing. And I wanted to go there and I wanted to study. I wanted to help to understand all these things. And I thought if we could figure that out, that could improve our situation. So here I am, this contemporary American historian looking at the South as a foundation of a pathology, American pathology. Now, just because I think that doesn't mean that that's the way the Southerners would feel at all. And they didn't feel that way at all. The Southerners were happy with themselves. The Southerners felt that they were good people. The slave owners thought that they were good people. You have the ability often to just, in your own mind, make yourself feel good at whatever it is that you are doing, okay? So I want you to know that even though I see them as problematic in terms of my historical view, they saw themselves as successful. They felt good about they felt good about the South. And they're willing to fight a war to protect the South. I don't think you fight a war for anything that you don't believe in, absolutely. And by the way, the Northerners, I don't think the Northerners would have ever fought a war to protect the North or to sustain the North. They're unhappy. And the irony of the situation is that the Northerners are unhappy and confronting, the reality of their change and struggling with that. And the Southerners are basically happy and satisfied and feel successful about their situation, even though I shouldn't say you, I feel that they are something of a pathology, but on their own terms, they felt that they were good people and they believed in the South, so they saw the South as a successful society. And of course, we're not talking about black people now, right? We're talking about the Southern whites believed that their society was a good society. I got a little expression of this one time. I worked on a Christmas tree farm when I was a teenager, And on this beautiful sunny December day, it was probably 70 degrees, sunshine, gorgeous and everything. And my job was I'd go, this was a live Christmas tree farm. The guy would pick out a tree, I'd go out and cut it, and I'd bring it in and, sometimes bag it and put it on the roof, tie it on the roof. And so I delivered this guy's tree to his car. I put it up on the roof, and I'm in the process of tying it down with twine and stuff like that. And this man had a really heavy Southern accent, and he was decrying the weather, like, oh, I can't take this Southern California weather. And of course, I'm looking for a tip, so I'm like going, yeah, it's pretty miserable out here, isn't it? Okay. And so he goes, I can't wait to get back to God's country. That's what he said. I can't wait to get back to God's country. So I couldn't help myself. I should have just kept my mouth shut. He said, I didn't say it quite like this, but I said, well, I know that Las Vegas is the devil's country, but where exactly is God's country? And of course, he told me that South Carolina was God's country, and all I could say was, well, sir, I hope you get back there as soon as possible. And of course, because that was a little bit of sarcasm and snark, I did not get any tip whatsoever. But I felt like it was kind of worth it, all right. And all that tells me, though, is that Southern people, we look at the South and we see all kinds of issues even today. Mississippi is routinely ranked 50th in every category you can possibly imagine, of course. And the health of the South is always somewhat problematic, and the relative poverty. But that doesn't mean that Southern people don't love the South. And I get that in many ways. There are things to love about it. There's no doubt about that. But anyway, the people who lived in the Old South, they absolutely loved their society, and they saw it as a good and successful society. Okay, so we have this rural, agrarian, homogeneous, stable, and on their own terms successful society, which provides us the basic characteristics of the Old South, which in so many ways are very different, of course, than the North. I do want to just kind of give you a simple picture of their class structure too. So, like everything, it's pretty simple and straightforward in the South. And if I could do this, of course, I always do my big triangle on the board for you guys and try to give you a sense of the classes. And of course, I would put at the very bottom the slaves, and I would do my diagonal line across there, which suggests that they are separated not by class lines, but by caste lines, the uncrossable line between, of course, white and black. But what I'm doing here is just, looking at the white component of the society, which was a class society. Remember that the concept of the class society allows for mobility. You can go up, and don't forget that you can also go down in a class society. But let me just give you a sense of the social structure of the South. And again, kind of straightforward, basic, a tripartite, so three groups associated with the social structure. At the bottom were the Po whites, and you can't really see it, but there's a little, accent mark there on the Po part. So the joke is, of course, that the poor whites were so poor that they couldn't afford the O and the R and became the Po whites. And I have to tell you, the poor whites of the South, there are so many ways of describing them, and sometimes they've done it themselves. But we've got the crackers, the hicks, the wool hat boys, the rednecks, the Po white trash. That's one of the more famous ones, of course. All these ways of kind of describing the white poor as far as the South was concerned. I do want you to know that the white poor, it's a relatively small group. If you think about it, the vast majority of people at risk to be poor in the South would have been the slaves. And the slaves, of course, could be the poverty element, but they're enslaved, of course. They're sustained, they're dependents within the slave system, basically. There were white people who were relatively poor, there's no doubt about that. I spent part of my research trying to find and identify the poor whites. And I ultimately came upon, instead of looking at the poor whites as a group, identifying paupers. These were the public dependents of Mississippi. I am the world's leading expert on poor relief in antebellum Mississippi, and actually postbellum Mississippi also, Mississippi after the Civil War also. So these were the relatively poor people. Many of them lived in areas that were far away from the plantation activity. I mean, that makes sense, right? If you're not going to be a participant in that plantation economy, you're going to be, and so we're going to find them in Appalachian, Kentucky, places like that. Those that lived within the realm of the plantations, it always was perceived as being awkward, especially by the Southern elite, that they would often live not too differently socioeconomically from the slaves. And we do have stories that there are interactions routinely, sometimes negative. They would fight with the slaves, or sometimes not negative. They would drink with the slaves. They would steal with the slaves. They would sleep with the slaves, all those kind of activities. And because of those interactions, this was very uncomfortable from the point of the Southern elite. That's one of the reasons that they tended to denigrate them and use these kind of negative terms to describe this group. But the reality was there aren't that many poor whites in the South, but they are part of the social structure I did want you to be aware of, okay? Of course, the mass of the Southern whites in the South, I'm just going to call them the middle-class farmers. That's that same group that I demonstrated for you guys in colonial America. That great mass of the society, probably representing close to 80% of the Southern white society, these middle-class farmers. Now, they are their own particular group, and they are an interesting kind of group. They live lives of rural simplicity. So remember, it's a rural society, rural agrarian society. They often lived in what they called the dog trot cabin. I love that, the dog trot cabin. So the idea was that you would have a cabin with two parts to it, and in between there would be a breezeway. And the breezeway was most important, simply like it says, to catch the breeze. You know, it gets so hot in the South, of course. And these are, you know, they could often be like a log cabin kind of structure. And sometimes in the summer you would, you know, kick the chinks out, you know, kick the stuff between the logs to get some kind of air movement. You know, I've read letters from the Old South, and these guys are talking about just miserably hot days, and all you can do is like lay down on the floor to try to make it through the high heat of the midday. Not much you can do otherwise. But the breezeway was to get whatever little air movement there was, you know, to take advantage of that. And they're called dog trot because the dog could just, you know, trot back up and through that area. Their economy was largely subsistence farming, which means that they farmed in a non-market orientation, so they farmed primarily for themselves. Routinely, they would have a marginal component of their crop, perhaps even cotton, which they would use then to buy the things that they would need, but primarily just, you know, farming for themselves, essentially. So what they would do. We describe them as being patriotic to a fault. It's like, you know, these are the guys that you tell them there's a war, they just go off and fight it. They're not going to ask any questions, you know. It's a classic, you know, general today, America love it or leave it attitude of those days. The South love it or leave it was the way that they would happen. But, you know, patriotic to a fault. Highly religious, but not necessarily always going to church, you know. And it's a classic kind of emotional religion, Protestant religion. This is the Bible Belt, right? And these guys were routinely, and in this case, you know, in the North, we would say that religion was something they turned to in the face of social change and things like that. In the South, you'd say they just simply turned to their church, to their faith in the face of just the difficulties of life and the difficulties of existence. You know, still highly religious people in their own particular kind of way. They were ignorant. And this seems so mean-spirited, you know, to say that they were ignorant, but so they were educated, you know, not educated, wrong word. They could read and write. They were literate. They were literate. That's the important thing. So this is kind of like a continuation of the story of colonial America. They were able to learn to read and write routinely. Not that everyone could, of course. There probably were a lot of poor whites that couldn't necessarily. But they had basic understanding of reading and writing and figuring. These are the basic skills, essentially. But they aren't learned, you know. There's no schools. There's no extension of the education. There aren't a lot of books for these people or anything like that. So relatively ignorant of like the outside world, of course, and other developments that might impact them in one way or the other. It's kind of, you know, describes the middle class farmers. And then finally, you know, I guess there's one after that, but very importantly in terms of the list, very localistic, very localistic. So that meant that they lived in their locale, in their area, and they were highly suspicious of anyone who came from outside, okay? I have to tell you that I have a really keen sense of this because I did my research in Mississippi, and I would go to I went to the State Archive, that's in Jackson, Mississippi, but I went to individual counties also, so county seats that were scattered across. And I would simply walk into the county courthouse area, and usually the county courthouses were relatively small, and I would ask people, you know, do you have any documents from the antebellum period that I could look at and stuff like that. And it seems like every time I would go anywhere, I mean, it happened to me again and again and again. I would walk in the door, I'd say, hi, I'm Chris. They would look at me and they'd say, you're not from around here, are you? I mean, we had to identify the fact that I wasn't a local, that I was not from Mississippi, you know. I'm coming from someplace else, in my case, you know, coming from California. They often would ask me, are you a Yankee or something like that? I said, well, no, I'm a Californian, you know. I believe that that's somehow kind of different. But I mean, they asked me so many, they said it to me so many times, you are from around here, are you? I thought about getting a t-shirt that said, I'm not from around here, am I? You know, just get over that part of it right from the very beginning. But to me, that was an indication, of course, of a powerful localism and a suspicion of outsiders. And of course, for the middle-class farmers, the people that they were most suspicious of were the Yankees. You know, someone from the north. What the hell's those damn Yankees doing down here? You know, that for them was a very problematic situation, and they would want to have that rectified in whatever they possibly could. So you have, last thing, critical thing about the middle-class farmers. They didn't generally own slaves. Only 25% of all Southerners owned slaves. So the vast majority of these guys aren't going to own it. There's like a little thin veneer of the elite level of the middle-class farmers. And these are guys, you know, who are trying to make their way up. And they often own maybe one or two slaves. So, you know, maybe it's somehow gathered together enough money or got it in inheritance or something like that. You know, you do see some of that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, the vast majority of these guys do not own slaves. And yet, and here's the critical point, and yet they supported slavery. They didn't own slaves, but they